Good morning. Thank you for joining me on the Meg Ellison Show on this wonderful Friday morning before a holiday weekend. I hope you have something exciting planned for the weekend. I've got some exciting things planned for the next 3 hours of programming gold, including my first guest, Will Flanders, who is the research director for the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Good morning, Will. How are you?
Good morning. Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad that you can join me to talk about your efforts on behalf of a coalition of organizations here in Wisconsin that have joined forces to protect and promote school choice here in Wisconsin.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We're working together on the Coalition for Education Freedom with a really broad spectrum of groups from across the sort of conservative libertarian movement in the state, as well as school choice advocacy folks. And, what we're here to discuss today is some negative articles that have come out in a number of different outlets, starting in Wisconsin Watch, now picked up by Wisconsin PBS, that are alleging that there's discrimination in the school choice programs. And these are tired, worn-out arguments that have existed for years, really since the founding of the program. But they seem to be getting a renewed interest, and I think that's because they see the progress the coalition is making towards expanding education freedom, and I think they're getting scared.
Well, so what are some of the things that, you want to set the record straight on? What are some of the things that they're alleging are going on within school choice that are so outrageous that this group has come together to make sure that the public is aware of what is true about school choice?
Yeah. So what brought about the little piece that we wrote earlier this week was some articles that allege that there's discrimination against students with disabilities in the school choice program, and we wanted to set the record straight and say that the schools in the choice program are subject to a number of regulations in state law. Some of the regulations we think are sort of overburdensome, and we could discuss that as well. But in terms of discrimination, the school choice program has to take all comers. There's no ability to discriminate against students with disabilities. Just like any other school, parents in the school have to work together to make sure that the school can actually accommodate the needs that the student has. And if a parent feels that a school isn't right for them, and of course they have the ability to move on. But the bottom line in our choice programs is that if there's more demand than supply, if there are more students that want to be in a school than there are seats available, the school doesn't get the choice to even choose the students they think are the best fit. They actually have to hold a lottery to determine which students get the seat. So it's purely based on chance, and there's no ability for these schools to discriminate. That's point one. I think the other key point to make is that if the Wisconsin Watch and if PBS are concerned about discrimination, and they think this is something that schools shouldn't be engaged in, I think they should turn their attention back to the public school system to some extent. While we're big supporters of the open enrollment program in the state, and we're big supporters of good education across the board, there are schools in Wisconsin that do discriminate in this way, and that are these specialty schools that we have in a number of cities around the state. Those schools do actually have sort of rigorous academic standards that students have to meet before they can be admitted. These are public schools that have standards in place that would be illegal for choice schools to have. And then in our open enrollment program, of course, you do see limitations on the number of seats. And there are a lot more reasons that students can be rejected for open enrollment than there are in the choice program.
So how did these different organizations come together? I mean, was it just because of the mutual benefit of having school choice in Wisconsin, or who was it that decided to organize? I mean, because I think you've got Americans for Prosperity Wisconsin, the Badger Institute, School Choice Wisconsin, and then their action, their other, I guess their foundation. I don't know if that's a foundation. Then of course your organization, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, and then Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce. Who decided it was I mean, I think it's a great idea, but who was instrumental in putting all the groups together?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that all of our groups individually, we've all been working in our own way on improving educational choice for years. But what we saw really early in the early part of last year is that there was tremendous momentum across the nation in terms of expanding educational options. And while we have long established school choice programs in the state here, uh, we knew that there was a lot of ways that they can be improved. The most important way is in recognizing that our choice programs are underfunded relative to public schools. So if you look at our public school funding per student, we're at over $15,000 per student. Whereas if you look at our choice programs, we're under $9,000 even for high school. And as we've seen massive inflation under President Biden, as we've seen sort of just costs in general increasing over time, it's very clear that if our programs are going to be preserved and expanded in the future, that we need to get a little bit closer to parity with the public school funding amount. So that was one of the key issues. Another key issue that's a little more complex, we probably don't need to go into a huge amount of detail on, is that we'd like to sort of decouple the choice programs from our property tax system. That'll lead to a property tax cut for folks across the board in the state of Wisconsin, and it really take away one of the major talking points that public schools like to use against choice, even though it's not completely true. If every student switched to choice, there would be savings to taxpayers, but they like to make the claim of this property tax impact, and we think that's important to change as well. So those were two key issues that all of these groups saw as critical, and we sort of came together to ensure that we get some of these changes made in state law. I think another important one to mention to highlight is that WMC. Obviously, some might wonder why is a organization focused on manufacturing and commerce interested in these topics, and the reality is that they see that when they get folks into the workforce, they're not prepared for the jobs that we have in today's world, and they recognize that the education system that we have in the state is a big problem. We have decades of evidence that school choice does a good or better job of getting kids to levels of proficiency, making sure that kids can read, and they recognize that that's a pathway to ensuring that there's a better workforce in the state in the future.
So talk about the disparity in funding that that the school or choice schools receive versus public schools.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, our public schools in the state are over $15,000 per student. I think for your listeners, when they're hearing from local school districts that they're underfunded, you should go check out our school scorecard website. You can see exactly what the schools in your area are spending, and in almost every case, they're at over $15,000 per student. And our coalition, we're not asking to get to that level. That's a pretty high level that I think a lot of taxpayers would be weary of if they knew that's what was actually being spent. But we do think we need to reach a little bit of a higher threshold that's closer to parity with the public schools. Maybe $11,000 per student for high school level, a little bit less for K through 8. But it's simply a question of fundamental fairness, right? Why does the value of a student change depending on which school door they walk through? We think that's unfair. We think choice schools, charter schools, open enrollment program, everyone should have ideally parity, but at least a little bit closer to parity so they can ensure they're able to do the best job they can for the students that they're working with.
What do you say to critics who say that, well, you know what, if you choose a private school, then, it's up to you to pay the tuition? I mean, because I think that's the argument is that, and I mean, I don't understand it. I don't understand how the left mind thinks anyway, but that would be their objection is that, well, as long as you're not going to utilize the public schools, then you're going to have to cough up the money.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is the only aspect of public life that the left seems to think is personal responsibility. That's the story, right?
Right.
And yet it's not the personal responsibility of adults. They want kids to be subjected to the personal responsibility of their parents. So, the case we would make is that, school choice is a fundamentally, conservative libertarian idea. It's an idea that was created originally by Milton Friedman back in the 1960s. But the notion that kids, should be subject to the whims of their parents and subject to the zip code that they grew up in, and that should be their only educational option, to me is pretty absurd. If you want to hold adults accountable and responsible for the decisions they make in their lives, that's great. We're fully on board with that. But it's not the fault of kids if their parents happen to be lower income, and kids should have every opportunity they can to achieve their goals.
Well, and I guess the argument that the public schools need so much money per student in order to properly educate them really doesn't jive with the proficiency scores or the proficiency of public school students. And so, let's compare and contrast the proficiency rates of choice school students versus public school students.
Yeah, so what we've seen in both our analyses and School Choice Wisconsin has done some looks at ACT scores and things like that as well, is that in almost every case, our choice and charter students are outperforming our public school students with significantly less funding per student, as we mentioned before. We did a report a few years ago that we called Bang for the Buck that shows the return on investment for taxpayers is much higher. It's far higher in choice and charter schools than it is in our public public schools around the state. Now, there are exceptions. There are some, great public schools, but when we're as a state producing proficiency rates in the 40% range in reading, where more than 60% of students aren't reaching proficiency thresholds in the most fundamental subject that there is, something's wrong, and we don't need to keep rewarding that system with even more money.
So that just goes to show that more money doesn't equal better education. I always use the example. Well, how did Laura Ingalls actually get a good education? How much do you think they were spending on students back in her day, right?
I'm guessing a one-room schoolhouse might have been a little less expensive than the 20 layers of bureaucracy that we have these days.
Right, and that's where the money goes, evidently. Well, Will, do you have anything else to add to this effort with regard to the coalition? Is there any information that is on your website or on a website that our listeners can look up?
Yep, just search Wisconsin Coalition for Education Freedom, and it'll be the first link that comes up. We have a good number of resources from all of the groups that you mentioned there. And for this particular piece, feel free to also check out will-law.org. You can find our full response that we made to some of these articles there as well.
And just one last thing about this Wisconsin Watch. It seems to me that this popped up just recently, or maybe it's just on my radar now, but it seems as if the timing is awfully curious in light of the recent state Supreme Court election decision.
Yeah, this is a group. It's a little bit. We're not fully sure of the origins, but what we're seeing so far is they sort of try to pass themselves off as a legitimate news organization, and you see that their stories are getting picked up by mainstream outlets. But they definitely seem to have a pretty strong left-leaning tilt, and we should be cognizant of that as you look at things that come out from them. Realize that it's coming through that filter, even if they try to present themselves as a nonpartisan organization.
Well, discernment is necessary in today's information age, that's for sure. Well, Will Flanders, thank you so much for joining me this morning from Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, will-law.org. Have a great weekend. Look forward to our next conversation.